Michael Jackson was halfway through Billie Jean when he suddenly stopped singing mid-verse, pointed toward the front row, and said words that made 72,000 people fall silent. "I need to find him." The band kept playing for a few confused seconds before Michael raised his hand, signaling them to stop completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with me," Michael said into his microphone, his voice trembling with emotion. "There's someone here tonight who needs this more than anyone else in the world." It was September 4th, 1988, at Soldier Field in Chicago. Michael Jackson was performing the second night of his Bad World Tour's final American shows, and the energy had been absolutely electric all evening. He already set the stadium on fire with Smooth Criminal, Beat It, and The Way You Make Me Feel. But what nobody in that massive stadium knew was that in the front row, seat 14, sat a man who wasn't there to celebrate. He was there to say goodbye. David Chen was a 34-year-old cardiac surgeon from Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Just 3 weeks earlier, on August 14th, his 7-year-old son Tommy had died in his arms after a 2-year battle with leukemia. Tommy Chen had been obsessed with Michael Jackson since he was 4 years old. His hospital room had been covered with Michael Jackson posters, and even during his most painful chemotherapy sessions, Tommy would ask his nurses to play Billie Jean because, as he told everyone, it made him feel like he could dance even when he couldn't move. David had promised Tommy something during those final days in the hospital, a promise that haunted him every waking moment since his son's death. "Dad, when I get to heaven, I'm going to dance with Michael Jackson," Tommy had whispered, his small voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "And you're going to see him perform Billie Jean for me. Okay? You have to go for both of us." David had tried to explain that he couldn't imagine going to a concert without Tommy, that it would be too painful. But Tommy had been insistent with the kind of clarity that dying children sometimes possess. "Promise me, Dad. You'll go and you'll wear my Michael Jackson shirt, and you'll dance for me. I need you to do this. I need to know you'll still live even when I'm gone." David had promised. It was the last conversation they had before Tommy slipped into unconsciousness. 3 days later, Tommy died holding his father's hand, wearing his favorite Michael Jackson t-shirt with a sparkly glove on the front. For 3 weeks after Tommy's death, David Chen barely functioned. He took leave from the hospital, unable to focus on saving other people's children when he couldn't save his own. His wife Sarah had retreated into complete silence, unable to speak about their loss. The house felt like a mausoleum, filled with Tommy's toys, his clothes, his drawings of Michael Jackson that covered the refrigerator. The concert tickets had been purchased 6 months earlier, back when Tommy was still responding well to treatment, back when they all believed in miracles. David had found them in Tommy's room, tucked carefully into a Michael Jackson biography that Tommy had read dozens of times. 2 tickets. One for Tommy, one for David. A father-son night that would never happen. On the morning of September 4th, Sarah had done something unexpected. She'd taken Tommy's favorite Michael Jackson t-shirt, the one he'd died in, and she'd carefully written something on the back with fabric paint. "For Tommy Chen, Dancing in Heaven, September 4th, 1988. Wear this tonight," Sarah had said, speaking for the first time in days. "Keep your promise to our son." So David Chen, a man drowning in grief, had driven to Soldier Field wearing his dead son's t-shirt. He'd gone alone, carrying the second ticket in his pocket like a talisman. He sat in seat 14, leaving seat 15, Tommy's seat, empty beside him. For the first hour of the concert, David sat motionless while 72,000 people screamed and danced around him. He wasn't really watching the show. He was remembering Tommy's face when they told him about these tickets, the pure joy that had lit up his thin, pale features. He was remembering how Tommy had practiced his moonwalk in the hospital hallway, even when he could barely stand, making the nurses laugh and cry at the same time. When the opening beats of Billie Jean began pounding through the stadium speakers, something broke inside David Chen. This was Tommy's song, the song he'd listened to thousands of times, the song he'd wanted to hear live more than anything in the world. David stood up, tears streaming down his face, and he began to dance. Not well, not with any coordination, but with the desperate, broken movements of a father trying to keep a promise to his dead son. He raised his arms above his head, swaying to the music, and he whispered, "This is for you, buddy. I'm dancing for both of us." Michael Jackson was in the middle of the second verse, moving with that supernatural grace that had made him the king of pop, when something caught his eye. In the front row, directly in his line of sight, was a man dancing alone with an empty seat beside him. But it wasn't the dancing that stopped Michael cold. It was the shirt the man was wearing and the words written on the back that Michael could clearly see as the man turned. For Tommy Chen, Dancing in Heaven. Michael Jackson stopped singing midward. The band, confused by the sudden silence, gradually slowed down and stopped playing. The massive crowd began to quiet as people realized something unusual was happening on stage. Michael stood completely still, staring at David Chen in the front row. His hand was pressed against his chest, and even from a distance, people could see that his eyes were filling with tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael said into his microphone, his voice thick with emotion, "please bear with me. There's someone here tonight who needs this more than anyone else in the world." The stadium fell into confused silence. Michael walked to the very edge of the stage and knelt down, so he was at eye level with David Chen in the front row. "Sir," Michael said gently, "what's your name?" David, still dancing, still crying, looked up at Michael Jackson with eyes that held more pain than any human should have to carry. "David Chen," he managed to say, his voice breaking, "I'm here for my son, Tommy." Michael closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, tears were streaming down his face too. "Tell me about Tommy," Michael said softly, and even though he was speaking just to David, his microphone carried his words to every corner of the massive stadium. David took a shuddering breath. "He was 7 years old," he said, his voice cracking with grief. "He died 3 weeks ago from leukemia. He loved you more than anything in the world. He made me promise to come here and dance for him. This was his shirt. These were his tickets. I'm trying to keep my promise." The stadium had gone completely silent. 72,000 people were holding their breath, witnessing something they instinctively knew was sacred. Michael Jackson stood up and did something that had never been done before in the history of major stadium concerts. He took off his iconic sequin jacket, the one that had become his trademark, and he handed it down to David Chen. "David," Michael said, his voice steady now despite the tears, "your son is here tonight. I can feel him, and we're going to finish this song together for Tommy." What happened next is difficult to describe without diminishing its power. Michael Jackson, the biggest entertainer on the planet, dedicated the rest of Billie Jean to a 7-year-old boy he'd never met. But more than that, he transformed the performance into something that transcended entertainment. Michael began singing again, but slower, more gentle, turning the iconic dance track into something that felt like a prayer. He sang directly to David Chen in the front row, making eye contact, nodding encouragement as David continued his broken, grief-stricken dancing. But here's the part that nobody who was there will ever forget. As Michael sang, he began pointing to different sections of the stadium, encouraging people to join in. Not with screaming or wild dancing, but with gentle swaying, with raised hands, with the kind of communal movement that felt like 72,000 people were embracing one grieving father and one lost little boy. The entire stadium began swaying together, 72,000 strangers moving as one, singing along softly, respectfully, turning Billie Jean into a memorial service for Tommy Chen. Michael sat down on the edge of the stage, his legs dangling over the side, still singing, still watching David. Security guards nearby were crying. Band members were crying. Even the hardened stadium crew, who had seen thousands of shows, were wiping away tears. When the song ended, the stadium didn't erupt into applause. Instead, there was a moment of profound silence, the kind of silence that feels holy. Then, slowly, gently, 72,000 people began to clap. Not the wild, screaming applause of a rock concert, but the steady, respectful applause of people who had just witnessed something that changed them. Michael stood up and spoke to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice still thick with emotion, "tonight we honored the memory of Tommy Chen, a 7-year-old boy who loved music, who loved life, and who reminded his father that even in our darkest moments, we have to keep dancing. David, Michael continued, looking directly at the man in the front row. You kept your promise to your son. Tommy knows that. We all know that. And I promise you that every time I sing this song for the rest of my life, I'll think of Tommy dancing in heaven. After the concert, something extraordinary happened. Michael's security team brought David Chen backstage, where Michael spent nearly 2 hours with him. They didn't talk much at first. Michael just sat with David in his dressing room, two men sharing grief in comfortable silence. Eventually, David told Michael everything about Tommy, about his love of music, his bravery during treatment, his determination to make others smile even when he was in terrible pain. Michael listened to every word, occasionally asking questions, often crying alongside David. Before David left that night, Michael gave him something precious. He took the sequin jacket he'd given to David during the concert, and he wrote on the inside lining, "For Tommy Chen, who reminded me why I sing. Dance forever, little man." Michael Jackson, September 4th, 1988. But Michael did something else too, something that nobody knew about for years. He asked David for Sarah's contact information, and for the next 6 months, Michael called the Chen family once a week. Not as Michael Jackson the superstar, but as Michael, a man who understood grief and wanted to help a family heal. David Chen kept his promise to Tommy that night at Soldier Field. But what he didn't know was that his act of love, his broken dancing in his dead son's shirt, would end up saving his own life. After that night, David told Sarah about his experience with Michael Jackson. They cried together for the first time since Tommy's death. They began talking about their son again, sharing memories instead of hiding from them. The jacket Michael had given David became a kind of shrine in their home, a reminder that grief doesn't mean forgetting to live. In 1990, David and Sarah Chen established the Tommy Chen Foundation for Pediatric Cancer Research. The foundation's motto, taken from what Michael said that night, is even in our darkest moments, we have to keep dancing. To date, the foundation has raised over $50 million for childhood cancer research and has funded treatments for hundreds of families who couldn't afford care. Michael Jackson was one of the foundation's first and most generous donors, and he remained actively involved with the organization until his death in 2009. The concert where Michael Jackson stopped Billie Jean for David Chen became legendary among his fans. Bootleg recordings of that night are among the most treasured Michael Jackson recordings in existence, not because of the musical performance, but because of the humanity they captured. Michael kept his promise to David and Tommy. For the rest of his career, every single time Michael Jackson performed Billie Jean, he would pause for just a moment before the second verse. In that pause, he would touch his chest with his hand, a subtle gesture that most audiences never understood. But those who knew the story recognized it. Michael was remembering Tommy Chen. He was honoring a promise made to a grieving father and a little boy dancing in heaven. The experience with David and Tommy Chen changed Michael Jackson in ways that weren't immediately obvious to the public. From that night forward, Michael began paying closer attention to his audiences. He started looking for the people who were alone, who seemed sad, who needed music for healing rather than just entertainment. He began incorporating moments of stillness into his shows, brief pauses where the spectacle stopped and genuine human connection could happen. Karen Fay, Michael's longtime makeup artist, said years later, after that night in Chicago, Michael understood his purpose differently. He realized that his music wasn't just about entertaining millions. It was about touching individuals, especially those who were hurting. Tommy Chen taught Michael that lesson. David Chen still lives in Chicago. He returned to his work as a cardiac surgeon, carrying the lesson his son and Michael Jackson taught him. That even when we're broken, even when we think we can't go on, we have to keep dancing. We have to keep living. We have to honor those we've lost by refusing to let grief destroy us. Every year on September 4th, David returns to what is now Soldier Field, though it's been rebuilt since that night in 1988. He sits in the same section where he sat with Tommy's empty seat beside him. He wears the sequin jacket Michael gave him, and he dances alone for a few minutes, keeping his promise renewed each year. In 2009, when Michael Jackson died, David Chen was one of the featured speakers at his memorial service. He told the story of that September night in 1988, and he held up the jacket Michael had given him, showing the inscription to the world for the first time. "Michael Jackson gave me this jacket," David said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "But really, he gave me my life back. He showed me that grief doesn't have to mean the end of joy, that we can honor the ones we've lost by continuing to dance, to love, to live." My son Tommy knew that. Michael knew that. And now, because of them, I know it too. Today, the sequin jacket hangs in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as part of a permanent exhibit on Michael Jackson's humanitarian work. The inscription is visible to everyone who visits. For Tommy Chen, who reminded me why I sing. Dance forever, little man. The story of Michael Jackson, David Chen, and Tommy Chen reminds us that sometimes the most important moments in life happen when we stop the show. When we recognize that there's someone in front of us who needs to be seen, to be heard, to be honored. Michael could have kept singing. He could have finished his performance without acknowledging the grieving father in the front row. After all, he had 72,000 other fans to entertain, and stopping a major stadium concert for one person had never been done before. But Michael chose differently. He chose to see David Chen's pain. He chose to honor Tommy Chen's memory. He chose to transform a concert into a memorial service, a dance floor into a sanctuary. And in doing so, he taught all of us that fame and talent mean nothing if we don't use them to acknowledge the humanity in everyone around us. David Chen went to that concert to keep a promise to his dying son. But he left